In every neighborhood, there's always that one story, whispered between back fences, murmured at mailboxes, spread carefully under the hum of polite small talk. The one about how things used to be perfect before someone stopped playing nice. In our neighborhood, that story started with plants. The first fine arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Crisp envelope, HOA seal embossed at the corner. Words polite but dripping with authority. Violation. Unapproved flora visible from roadway. Felt absurd at first. They had fined me for my plants. 2 jasmine shrubs and a row of native grasses that I'd planted to replace the wilted HOA-issued flowers that had long died from neglect. Low maintenance, drought-tolerant, beautiful, and apparently my greatest sin. I remember standing in my driveway, letter in one hand, pruning shears in the other, staring at my garden like I had committed a crime against suburbia. It wasn't about aesthetics, not really. It was about control. Every house on Maple Hollow Lane looked identical. Beige paint, regulation shutters, and the exact same imported rose variety lined in military precision across the front yards. My wild jasmine didn't fit their vision of conformity, and that meant punishment. At first, I paid the fine $100. Then the next one came, and the next, and the next, each one claiming new infractions. My mulch was the wrong material. My bushes exceeded maximum height code. My pots weren't regulation clay tone. The list grew faster than the plants themselves. It was laughable at first, until it wasn't. The fines became warnings. The warnings became threats. Failure to comply may result in legal action. The HOA board's president, Patricia Myers, made sure the threats came courtesy of official letterhead, each signed in her neat cursive below stamped signatures. Patricia wasn't subtle about her power. To her, the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of homes. It was a stage, and she was the director making sure every curtain matched the drapes. She patrolled the streets daily, measuring lawns with fold-out tape like a suburban law enforcer with nothing left to prove. And she loved rules, not for their necessity, but for the control they gave her. The other residents treated her like a necessary evil, polite in public, resentful in private. They whispered about how she fined retirees for invisible weeds, how she sent violation photos to homeowners with timestamps just minutes apart. But no one dared challenge her outright. HOA power wasn't about fairness. It was about precision, the ability to suffocate someone in paperwork until they gave up or gave in. And for months, I considered giving in too. Every morning, I'd open my mailbox afraid of more envelopes. I stopped tending my yard altogether, stripped the jasmine back until nothing but trimmed soil remained. But the fines didn't stop. They simply shifted. Now, the problem was exposed soil without appropriate plant covering. That was the first time I realized something critical. Compliance didn't end the punishment. Compliance was the punishment. I needed to understand why she was so obsessed with me, specifically. I wasn't the only non-compliant homeowner, but I was the only one she targeted on repeat. Some neighbors had tall grass, peeling paint, even unsanctioned fences. Yet none of them received letters like mine. Whatever it was personal now. So I started paying attention. That summer, the HOA held its quarterly community meeting in the clubhouse. Rows of folding chairs, stale coffee in styrofoam cups, and Patricia standing at a podium with her trademark pastel scarf, pretending to thank everyone for preserving the community's integrity. I sat quietly at the back, pretending to scribble notes while I actually took photos of the agenda on her clipboard. Not because I cared about the meeting, but because I noticed something strange. She kept writing numbers and initials that weren't in any financial report. It looked like shorthand, a code. And that was when the haze began to clear. The fines weren't random. She was documenting something, keeping score, in a way that felt too deliberate for record-keeping. Later that evening, I compared those scribbles to the list of properties she had fined the most over the past 6 months. Not all homeowners kept their letters, but I'd saved every one. When I laid them out, a pattern appeared. A set of recurring names and addresses, mine at the top, followed by 4 others. I checked county assessment records out of curiosity. Those same houses shared one thing in common. They had all declined to pay a new, optional landscaping improvement fee the HOA had introduced earlier that year. The fee supposedly covered community beautification, paving the clubhouse walkway, planting new hedges, trivial stuff. But when I drove by the properties that had paid, the beautification was conveniently clustered near their yards. Better walkways, fresher paint touch-ups, new flower beds. The realization hit slowly at first, then all at once. Patricia wasn't enforcing the rules. She was monetizing them. The fines weren't about violations, they were retaliation. A direct hit to anyone who refused to pay what was essentially a bribe disguised as a fundraiser. And it wasn't hard to imagine why she got away with it. The HOA board was small, hand-picked, and loyal. 2 of the members worked under her husband's property management firm. Another was her cousin. The treasurer, a quiet man named Glenn, handled all financial statements privately, never sharing more than neat summaries at public meetings. They had built their own miniature empire of control, unchecked and untouchable. But they hadn't met me yet. The tipping point came one Saturday morning. Another envelope on my doorstep, the same logo, the same tone. But this time it wasn't just a notice. It was a lien. They had filed an official lien against my property, over fines that totaled $600. That was the moment something inside me shifted. The quiet compliance that had kept me in check cracked in half. They wanted to play politics? Fine. But I had something they didn't. Patricia had built her authority on the comfort that no one was watching. I was going to change that. That afternoon, I bought a pocket voice recorder and a discreet camera that fit neatly inside my front porch light fixture. For the next 2 weeks, whenever Patricia made her rounds, inspecting, photographing, mumbling behind her clipboard, I captured everything. Every interaction, every passing comment, even one conversation between her and Glenn about transferring maintenance funds that didn't sound remotely like maintenance. I didn't know it yet, but those recordings were about to crack open everything. And when I was done with them, Patricia wouldn't just lose her position. She'd face something far worse than embarrassment, because by the time I finished, she and her little HOA empire were going to get served, literally. The morning after I installed the first hidden camera, the world looked ordinary. Birds still chirped on fence posts. Kids still biked past driveways. Yet underneath that normality, I felt electricity, the subtle hum of intent that comes when you're quietly building a case that could topple something big. For once, the power wasn't theirs. It was mine. Patricia's routine was predictable, almost theatrical. Every other morning at 7 a.m. sharp, she'd begin her HOA inspection rounds. Clipboard in hand, sandals clacking against pavement, floral perfume cutting through the air like authority in liquid form. She'd pause at each house for no more than 30 seconds, long enough to scribble notes and take photos. She moved through the neighborhood like she was auditing soldiers, not neighbors. But at my house, she always lingered. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe she was just thorough. But the recordings proved otherwise. Patricia would stop at the edge of my driveway, muttering under her breath about nonconformity and examples needing to be set. On one occasion, she even gestured toward my house and whispered to the man beside her, "He'll fold eventually." They all do. Every second of that ended up documented. Within a week, I had hours of footage, her subtle smirks, offhand comments, instruction slips given to Glenn, the treasurer. But there was one detail that struck me most. She always carried a navy folder marked in gold lettering, Beautification Fund. It wasn't on any HOA-issued documentation I'd ever seen. One evening, while reviewing footage at my kitchen table, I caught something crucial. Patricia, standing on the corner of Rosehill Drive, flipping through that file with visible frustration. She had several checks in her hand, each labeled with resident names. Every check looked nearly identical, all payable to the HOA, all labeled beautification. But when I froze the frame and zoomed in, the deposit endorsement stamp didn't match the HOA's account signature visible on our public ledger copies. That's when the whisper of suspicion became fact. The HOA wasn't just fining residents, they were pocketing. Those funds weren't looping back into the neighborhood. They'd been funneled somewhere else entirely. I decided I needed direct clarity. That meant catching them in their own words. The next HOA meeting was the perfect opportunity, a meticulously dull affair where few residents ever showed, allowing Patricia full command of the room. That night, I did what I always did. Showed up early, quiet, and compliant. But this time, the voice recorder sat safely tucked within my jacket, running non-stop. At 6:15 p.m., under hums of old fluorescent lights and the faint shuffle of paperwork, the meeting began. Patricia stood in front as always, polished, poised, her hair perfect. Glenn sat beside her, expression unreadable, pen scratching constantly across spreadsheets. She opened with her usual script, "Thank you for preserving our community, improving neighborhood value." The same half-truths meant to lull the few attendees into complacency. I nodded along, pretending to agree, but my focus wasn't her speech. It was her whispers in between. Every time she leaned toward Glenn, my recorder caught snippets. Words like transfer, invoice, and deposit batching. The most revealing was one quiet exchange near the meeting's end. Muffled but distinct enough to catch the phrase, "Same account as the landscaping project." The landscaping project. The one no contractor could ever identify when we asked. The same one that kept draining HOA funds year after year. That phrase was the missing puzzle piece. The checks matched the so-called beautification fund, which connected directly to this phantom project. It wasn't a fund for landscaping at all. It was their slush budget. And the board wasn't just aware of it. They were orchestrating it. The next week was almost unbearable. Every fine that showed up in my mailbox, every time Patricia strolled past smirking like a queen in her kingdom, my anger pulsed louder. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to shove the recordings across her clipboard and watch her face collapse under truth. But fury isn't strategy. Patience was. Instead, I built a quieter plan, one built not on passion but precision. I started gathering patterns, how often fines were issued, which residents received them, how the collected payments aligned with Patricia's beautification deposits. When I matched HOA-issued receipts to bank timestamps on electronically scanned checks, the money trail was undeniable. The funds weren't flowing to the HOA vendor accounts at all. They were landing in a private LLC registered under her husband's management company. Every payment meant for community upkeep was padding their personal income. And Patricia had used those specific fines, my fines, to feed it. My house wasn't just a nuisance to her. It was her income stream. The more I uncovered, the heavier the truth became. We'd all been paying into a system of extortion disguised as governance. The HOA had become less about property and more about profit, our submission, her leverage. I started piecing together evidence not as a resident, but as someone building a legal exhibit. Screenshots, recorded time logs, copies of every notice and fine sent my way. Each item cataloged, dated, and saved in multiple locations, including an encrypted drive offsite. Then came the hardest part, getting confirmation from someone on the inside. Glenn was the weakest link. Quiet, reserved, and visibly uncomfortable every time Patricia spoke. Over a month, my recordings showed a change in his tone, subtle but noticeable. He'd begun asking quieter questions, pausing longer before signing her reports. He wasn't complicit anymore, he was scared, and fear was fuel. It took one strategically timed exchange for me to solidify everything. One rainy Thursday, I accidentally approached him while he was closing the HOA office. Small talk, nothing serious, but I'd left my porch mic recording with precision range. 30 minutes later, I captured what I needed. His confession. He wasn't specific, never said embezzlement out loud, but his words said enough. "I can't keep transferring funds like this," he muttered. "If they ever audit us, they'll find everything. Everything." When I replayed those words that night, I felt something in my chest shift. Not like victory, not like satisfaction, but relief laced with resolve. The game was practically over. Patricia just didn't know it yet. And the real irony? While she poured months of energy into policing the exact shade of my garden roses, I was quietly collecting the evidence that would destroy her career, her reputation, and her beloved HOA dynasty in one final strike. All I needed now was the right moment to make it public, and the one place no one expected it would happen. A courtroom. The HOA had filed a small claims suit against me the following week for my unpaid fines. They thought they were calling me in for judgment, but they had actually invited me to their own downfall. Because when that hearing day came, Patricia wouldn't just see me defend myself. She'd watch her empire crumble, on record, under oath, in a room where cameras never lie. The morning of the hearing dawned sharp and cold, the kind of day that carries weight even before it begins. The sky hung heavy over the courthouse, pale and silent, a fitting prelude to what was about to unfold. For Patricia, this day would mark another victory. For me, it would be the day everything changed. By the time I arrived, she was already there, perfectly dressed, composed, exuding confidence like armor. The members of her loyal little board stood nearby, whispering eagerly, no doubt expecting to watch her humiliate me into compliance. I glanced at them briefly and said nothing. Quiet was my greatest weapon now. Inside, the courtroom buzzed faintly with the polite tension of small claims proceedings. The rows of pews were nearly empty, except for a few nosy residents from the neighborhood who'd shown up out of curiosity. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper, the scent of structure, rules, and justice. How ironic. When Patricia's case was called, she rose with that same smile she always wore when issuing fines. To her, this wasn't a trial. It was a formality, another chance to flex the authority she'd spent years cultivating. She presented the HOA's claim like a master conductor, clear documents, confident tone, talk of responsibility to uphold standards. She had evidence, of course, photos of my so-called violations, stacks of infraction notices, and invoices showing I refused to pay. It was a flawlessly rehearsed performance of order and compliance. Every word designed to portray her as the enforcer of harmony and me as the rebel who disrupted it. When it was my turn, I didn't rush. I didn't argue. I simply placed my folder on the table and began to unravel her story, one piece at a time. First came the fines, chronologically, neatly organized, each one time-stamped and filed. Then, slowly, I began producing the recordings. Every clip carefully cued, every image printed to match her words. The first video drew a few murmurs from the courtroom. It showed Patricia standing on my property line, whispering insults under her breath, threatening examples. The second showed her laughing with Glenn, calling me another tree hugger who needs humbling. Her expression faltered. When I played the audio of her discussing transfers and shared accounts, the silence in the courtroom became pointed. The tone of assurance she carried earlier began to wobble, ever so slightly. The judge leaned forward, attentive but neutral. Then came the evidence she couldn't twist, financial records. The beautification fund payments, the mismatched deposit stamps, the bank registry showing deposits into a property management account belonging to her husband's firm. I backed it all with county documentation, every number airtight. What began as her small claims complaint had just turned into something dangerously close to a fraud investigation. Right there, in real time, Patricia shifted in her seat, clasping her hands tightly. Her famous poise began unraveling thread by thread. The board members behind her exchanged nervous looks but stayed quiet. Patricia shifted in her seat, clasping her hands tightly. Her famous poise began unraveling thread by thread. The board members behind her exchanged nervous looks but stayed quiet. I continued, calmly and methodically, walking the court through every document, every timestamp, every recording. No emotion, just truth served cold. The judge took notes silently, his pen scratching across the desk, and I watched Patricia shrink a little more with every detail. The very picture of a person realizing they'd wandered into a battle they couldn't control anymore. When I finally finished, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the hum of the ceiling lights. There was no triumphant moment, no cinematic declaration, just stillness. The judge's expression gave nothing away, but the decision came swiftly. The HOA's claim was denied. The lien was voided, and based on the evidence presented, he noted the possibility of further criminal inquiry into the association's accounting practices. That last part landed like a thunderclap. Patricia froze. Glenn looked like he might faint. The officers standing by the wall quietly stepped forward to collect copies of the financial documents for evidence. Official channels had just been opened. My little garden war had become an investigation. By the time the session ended, Patricia's polished composure was gone completely. Her smile had dissolved into something hollow, disbelief laced with silent fury. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She simply gathered her papers and left, her heels striking the floor too quickly, echoing against the walls as the illusion of power crumbled around her. Outside the courtroom, the cold air felt different, clean, sharp. The small crowd of residents who had attended stood quietly for a few seconds before one of them nodded, almost in reverence. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak loudly. They just understood. For the first time in years, the HOA didn't own my voice. It didn't own anyone's. Within 48 hours, word spread through the neighborhood like spilled ink. Every resident who'd been fined, harassed, or intimidated began sharing their stories. Patricia's empire of control was collapsing inward, piece by piece. The board called an emergency session, but it didn't matter. The county audit had already started. Financial records were seized. The beautification fund accounts frozen. Glenn, to his credit, stepped forward and cooperated fully. His testimony about pressure to process unauthorized transfers sealed the investigation. Patricia's downfall wasn't explosive. It was quiet, the kind of downfall that doesn't end with shouting but with the deafening silence of consequences. Within 2 weeks, she resigned. The HOA froze its operations pending criminal findings, and residents called for complete reformation under state supervision. It was strange witnessing it, the slow dismantling of something so long untouchable. I thought victory would taste sweeter, sharper. But what I felt most was exhaustion. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting against something that should never have had power over you in the first place. The neighborhood changed slowly after that. The clipped hedges and strict lawns began to bloom wild again. Gardens reflected individuality instead of rules. People painted, rebuilt, repurposed. And as for the fines, they disappeared as though they'd never existed. Still, no one saw Patricia again. Rumors said she'd moved away, her husband's firm under investigation. Some whispered that she swore she'd been betrayed, not beaten, that she was set up. But no one cared anymore. Her power was gone, and the community she'd ruled by fear was finally learning freedom. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile when I walked past the HOA office now gathering dust. I just breathed easier. It's funny how something as ordinary as jasmine can start a war. But maybe that's what happens when control meets resistance. Something small grows roots too deep to destroy, and as the first blooms return to my yard, they're sent drifting gently through the air. I realized this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming peace, one flower, one truth, one battle at a time. But I knew it wasn't completely over yet, because the fine might have been voided, and Patricia might have run. But the audit had only just begun. And if what I found in the HOA's records was just the surface, what lay beneath could shake far more than just one neighborhood. The audit came faster than anyone expected. By the end of that same month, county investigators had moved into the HOA office, or what used to be its prideful heart. The board's bright blue banner, once displaying glossy photos of our award-winning community, had been taken down, leaving faint outlines on the wall like a ghost of its former authority. Each morning, unmarked sedans parked along Maple Hollow Lane, their drivers stepping out with folders and briefcases. They weren't residents, they were auditors, accountants, investigators. Their presence alone turned the once proud neighborhood into a murmuring backdrop of quiet panic. Neighbors who used to glare at me now avoided eye contact altogether, afraid to even speak the wrong name aloud. It was surreal watching the heart of the HOA, our ultimate enforcer, stripped down piece by piece. They cataloged documents, removed file boxes, photographed ledgers. Every few days, a resident received a knock at the door, followed by uncomfortable questions about payments, fines, or letters that suddenly didn't exist in the official record. The illusion was over. Patricia's empire hadn't been an isolated act of pettiness. It was extensive. The investigation found that nearly 65 homeowners had been fined over fabricated rules and personal grievances. Thousands of dollars meant for beautification had instead been redirected to private accounts, encrypted transfers, and vendor payments that never existed. The audit also exposed how deep the corruption went. Falsified meeting minutes, rigged elections, and intimidation tactics that silenced any resident who questioned authority. The HOA wasn't a system of order. It was a personalized profit scheme operating between strands of bureaucracy. Ironically, it was Glenn's testimony that broke it all wide open. The same quiet accountant who once buried his guilt under paperwork had finally decided to come clean. Records showed that Patricia's husband's company had managed multiple HOA boards across the county, each routed through the same beautification fund. The money trail stretched far beyond our neighborhood. At the core of it all was Patricia herself, the picture of composure, manipulation, and greed. She hadn't just exploited the system, she'd built it around herself. When the news broke publicly, headlines used words like embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of community funds. Word spread fast across counties, across forums, across homeowners groups that had once celebrated tight regulations as community excellence. Now, they looked at their own boards differently. Restless nights came not from fear anymore, but disbelief. Neighbors began to knock on my door more often, asking questions. Cell phones in hand, they wanted guidance, how to gather proof, where to file complaints, how to stand up like I had. Some thanked me, awkwardly but sincerely. Others just wanted to unburden their stories. Years of silent anger made safe to speak aloud. I didn't see myself as a hero. I'd simply refused to be humiliated into silence. But in a neighborhood where compliance was religion, my refusal had felt like rebellion. The county eventually announced a civil lawsuit against the HOA and its management partners. Accounts froze across multiple properties. Patricia's pleasant smile, once plastered on the glossy HOA newsletter, now replaced mugshots and headlines. She tried to deny it all, claiming persecution, bias, anything to cling to respectability. But corruption doesn't survive sunlight. The reporters came next, quiet, polite, relentless. Cameras parked at the edge of the street, interviewing frightened residents and flustered board members. My face appeared on local segments, though I avoided interviews whenever possible. Everyone wanted to hear the story of the man who took down the HOA, but the truth was quieter than the narrative they wanted. It hadn't been revenge for petty fines. It had been survival. What people didn't see were the nights spent sleepless, replaying footage, fearing retaliation. Or those moments when I nearly gave up, when I questioned whether I just made myself a bigger target. Still, the payoff wasn't money or fame. It was something simpler. It was mowing my lawn without glancing over my shoulder. It was growing the jasmine back where it belonged. By spring, the neighborhood changed in ways none of us expected. Without the HOA's constant leash, people adapted in unpredictable ways. Some painted fences vibrant colors, some let wildflowers bloom freely, others simply stopped caring about uniformity. Chaos, maybe, but beautiful chaos. The brittle control that once suffocated daily life dissolved into something that finally resembled community. For the first time in years, I saw people help each other. Instead of sending warnings, neighbors shared leftover paint. Instead of fines, people lent tools. The same residents who had feared Patricia's clipboard now gathered freely. Casual barbecues replacing mandated board meetings. It was liberation disguised as untidiness. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter. Not from lawyers, not from auditors, but from Glenn. It was handwritten, its edges smudged like he'd lingered too long on the decision to send it. He thanked me, awkwardly, and said that he'd finally sworn an oath in court, handing over every document Patricia had forced him to conceal. He'd lost his job but gained peace. His final sentence read, "You were right. Compliance was the crime." That line stuck with me for days, because Glenn was right. Compliance wasn't passive. It was survival by surrender. And surrender was exactly what people like Patricia fueled their power on. The courthouse eventually ruled in favor of restitution. Residents received letters promising compensation. Though the sums could never repay the years of control, anxiety, and false debt. Patricia's name disappeared from every legal register. Her husband's business license was permanently revoked. Their house eventually went up for sale. It sat empty for months. No one wanted to buy it. Its once-groomed lawn grew into wild grass, fitting, I thought. Nature reclaiming what control had ruined. As for me, I stayed. The garden grew freely again, jasmine spilling across fences, the scent plain but triumphant. Every bloom reminded me that resistance didn't just mean standing up. It meant staying when others wanted you gone. The investigation dragged on quietly even after her name faded. The county uncovered more. Several other HOAs tied to similar accounts. Nearly identical beautification schemes repeating across neighboring districts. Patricia had been part of something systemic. A chain of greed hiding behind manicured lawns and plastic smiles. By the time the case closed officially, she'd gone silent. No interviews, no statements. The last anyone heard, she'd moved 2 states away. Yet her empire's downfall left something bigger behind: awareness. Across counties, homeowners started attending meetings again. Not as bystanders, but as watchdogs. Every voice that once trembled under false authority now carried subtle strength. And though peace settled on Maple Hollow again, something fundamental had changed. The control was gone, but its memory remained. A quiet, pulsing scar that reminded us how fragile freedom became when wrapped in the illusion of order. By the final hearing, the judge summarized it perfectly. What begins with power over plants rarely ends with just plants. A simple truth, buried in legal phrasing, carved itself deep into everyone in that courtroom. Because what Patricia had built wasn't just an HOA. It was a symbol of human obsession with control. And what destroyed it wasn't anger or defiance. It was patience, the slow, steady unraveling of deceit that couldn't withstand its own reflection. I'd expected guilt or pride when it was finally over. Instead, I felt something smaller but purer. Relief. The kind of relief that smells faintly like jasmine on a spring morning. Something that had finally bloomed again, unafraid this time. Spring came early that year, soft rain washing away the last remnants of winter's grip, as if the whole neighborhood was trying to cleanse itself of everything that had happened. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the cracks of mailboxes, in the uneven lawns, in the faint rustling silence that hung behind every front door. What once had been a place obsessed with order now looked alive. Imperfect, disorganized, but free. The grass grew wild in places, the fences weren't symmetrical, and the uniform rows of color-coded mailboxes were slowly repainted in shades of individuality. Pale blues, cherry reds, rustic browns. Every small act of defiance had become a monument to what we had survived. In many ways, Patricia's destruction hadn't ruined our community. It had revealed it, raw and human beneath all the polish she'd forced upon it. The HOA office stood empty now, its glass door covered in taped notices from auditors and lawyers. The laminated office hours sign still hung crookedly, untouched since the day investigators boxed up its files. The space felt sterile, abandoned, as though stripped of its soul along with its control. Every time I passed it, I'd pause briefly, not in triumph but reflection. Power leaves stains that outlast victory, and this place had been soaked in it. Yet new energy replaced the old fear. Neighbors began meeting voluntarily, not in mandated meetings under fluorescent lights, but under porches and backyards. Decisions weren't voted through memos. They were shaped through conversation. It was messy, loud at times, but real. People I hadn't spoken to in years now waved when I walked my dog. A retired teacher down the street offered a coffee every Sunday, her way of apologizing for all the years she kept quiet to avoid trouble. Couples who once hid behind HOA-approved hedges now hosted community cookouts. Some days, I'd look around and wonder if this was what the place had always meant to be before perfection ruined it. Freedom in its simplest form. The legacy of what happened started spreading beyond Maple Hollow. Local news stations aired follow-ups on the county's crackdown of HOA embezzlement scams. Other neighborhoods began holding open audits. Committees were dismantled, replaced by transparent councils run by actual residents instead of self-elected tyrants. The idea of community service was finally returning to what it should have meant all along: service, not control. A few months later, a lawyer from the county reached out to me. The case had reached its final stage, sentencing. They wanted me to attend, not as a witness this time, but as a symbol of the residents who'd suffered in silence. I went, not out of revenge, but out of curiosity. Courtrooms had a strange stillness, a kind of antiseptic air filled with finality. Patricia didn't look like the woman who once prowled our streets in pressed linen and control. She shrank into her chair, her hair grayer, face pale. She avoided my eyes, but I caught one quick glance. Not of hatred, but of disbelief. As if she still couldn't understand how the system she'd built had turned against her. The judge's voice was steady as he read the ruling. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Fines, restitution, and supervised probation. It wasn't prison, but it was humiliation. The exact thing she had weaponized against everyone else. When it was over, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt done. Walking out of that courtroom, I realized that her downfall wasn't the end of a feud. It was a reminder of how fragile control becomes when stripped of morality. Power doesn't vanish when one person falls. It waits quietly, ready for the next person blind enough to crave it. Back home, the days settled into something beautifully boring. For the first time in years, I wasn't watching every mailbox, every folded notice, every letterhead logo. The neighborhood had learned to breathe again, and so had I. Sometimes, I'd find old documents buried in drawers, fine notices, meeting minutes, letters with Patricia's signature curling at the bottom. I kept a few of them, tucked away in a folder marked, "Keep for record," not as trophies, but as reminders, because complacency had been her ally once, and it could be again if we forgot how it began. Months rolled into a year. The garden exploded in color, jasmine overtaking the fences, lavender spilling across the walkways. A neighbor down the street who used to fear violation notices now let sunflowers climb over her mailbox, their heads tilted toward the sun as if unapologetically alive. The HOA board never returned. We formed a cooperative instead, smaller, transparent, ordinary. We called it the Maple Hollow Committee, a name with none of the menace and all of the meaning. No fines, no coercion, just a shared note on who'd mow the park fields or clean leaves from the community path. True balance, I learned, isn't silence. It's accountability. Looking around now, I realized how strange power works. People obsess over having it, but the real strength lies in taking responsibility without needing control. Every time I passed the corner where Patricia used to inspect the lawns, I remembered the way she'd tilt her head, searching for flaws. She believed perfection was ownership. But all along, perfection wasn't power, peace was. One summer evening, as the sun set golden across the neighborhood, I stood in my yard, hands covered in soil, jasmine blooming freely beside me. A faint breeze carried the scent through the fence, and somewhere nearby, someone laughed, free, loud, unrestrained. It hit me then just how far we'd come. I hadn't just won my freedom from fines. I'd helped carve space for other voices to exist without fear. People were no longer trimming themselves to fit an expectation. They were living, messy, joyful, human. That, more than the courtroom victory or the headlines, was the true legacy. The day Patricia got served wasn't just the day one tyrant fell. It was the day the rest of us remembered we didn't need permission to live our own lives. My story had spread, sure, but it wasn't about me anymore. It belonged to anyone who'd ever been told they weren't compliant enough, anyone who'd been silenced by arrogance disguised as authority. And that night, as I packed away the last of the evidence, the tapes, the files, the old notices, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not the sterile, rule-bound peace of Patricia's reign, but the genuine quiet that follows a storm. When I turned off the porch light, the jasmine glowed faintly in the moonlight, growing wild and untamed, the way it was always meant to. And I smiled, not because the fight was over, but because, finally, I didn't have to fight anymore.